How does one use silence to show conflict? Throughout different points in the latter half of the 20th century, Indonesia and Spain were both embroiled in internal conflict that led to the persecution, torture, and murder of various groups of people. Several decades later, the survivors and their family members continue to ask one question: why have the perpetrators of these crimes not been brought to justice? In 2014's The Look of Silence, Adi, our protagonist, the sibling of one such victim, and now an optometrist, comes face to face with some of the perpetrators of the killings that occurred years ago, seeking explanations for the events that took place. In the meantime, we are faced with the consequences of the killings and some of their survivors as they try to live on. On the other hand, 2018's The Silence of Others covers the 2010s case against crimes of the Franco regime, where several survivors and their relatives have joined together to seek justice against some of the perpetrators of crimes against humanity that were carried on during the regime, and several of the laws that were put in place to not just protect them, but in some cases even honour them. At their core, both of these films are about confrontation. That is, confrontation between victims and perpetrators. And as their titles imply, silence is being used metaphorically to represent that confrontation between those two sides. In talking about documentaries, American film critic and academic Bill Nichols describes documentary film as an organized sequence of sounds and images that construct metaphors that assign, infirm, affirm, or contest values that surround social practices about which we as a society remain divided. In The Look of Silence, Joshua Oppenheimer largely represents this division through dialogue, making the brilliant decision of flipping the concept of the talking head on its side by having an additional layer to the interviews. By having the film's main protagonist, Adi, talk to and interact with various of the perpetrators in the same room, we get to see him not just participate in the discourse, guiding it, but more importantly for our analysis, we get to see his reaction and silent demeanour to the testimonies of the crimes that were committed against his brother and various other victims. Oppenheimer expands on this concept on other scenes by featuring not just victims and perpetrators, but also the perpetrators' families and relatives, creating a rather uncomfortable scene where each face is telling a different story of how these individuals are coping with the information being disclosed. Thus, one of the main purposes behind all this talking is, curiously, silence, if only in the short term. Now, up to this point, I've been talking about silence, but I've not explained what I meant by it. Silence in film can be interpreted as a complete lack of sound from any source whatsoever, be it diegetic or otherwise. But just like documentaries seek to portray the real world in a non-fictitious manner, its soundscape must also follow that belief. And in that sense, silence in documentary should follow our interpretation of it as we perceive it in the real world, meaning that more often than not, silence is the absence of any meaningful sound. Gustavo Montes further specifies that silence in a dialogue isn't a vacuum. It takes up time in the film sequence. Thus, it is the lack of speaking by itself that gives it meaning. The characters have the chance to speak, or the chance to stay quiet. As he says, in conversation, silence, if lasting, is a way of externalizing intimacy. Outside of dialogue, it is with the meaningless, be it cars on a highway, the sounds of nature, or wind against a building, that the filmmakers then construct meaning. Robert Bresson, famous minimalist French director who lived through the invention of sound in cinema, once famously said that the soundtrack invented silence. That is, it was through having sound in a film for the first time ever that the more quiet moments in it could be appreciated. But these films are framing their stories as confrontations, even though these confrontations aren't always being shown through dialogue. A frequent motif used in The Look of Silence places our protagonist, Adi, in front of a television as he watches motionless several videos of interviews made with several members responsible for the killings prior to meeting them in real life. Other than helping him prepare for the meeting, it also places an additional barrier between him and the perpetrators, stopping him from interacting in a form of dialogue, at least temporarily. The Silence of Others briefly flips this idea by placing Chato, one of the torture victims featured in the film, watching a TV report where they interrogate his torturer on the street. His laugh early on in the shot continues to make apparent the improved openness with which one can tackle these issues in Spain, compared to in Indonesia. But said laugh quickly makes way for much of the same imagery that we see in the aforementioned film, and sounds, as we say prior. No amount of improvements, it seems, can heal past wounds. This type of barrier, while removed later on in The Look of Silence, is more prevalent in The Silence of Others. In an interview with Almudena Carracedo, she states that attempts were made to interview and feature some of the perpetrators mentioned in the film, but were answered with refusal or unacceptable conditions. So, the question is, how is it that they portrayed these confrontations without showing any actual dialogue between our characters? Near the beginning of the film, Maria Martin tells us the events that led to her father being murdered and buried unceremoniously, only for the gravesite to be later on paved over by a highway. The location of the gravesite wasn't forgotten, but rather ignored. She shows us several of the letters she sent the authorities, begging for help in recovering his corpse, and all of them ignored. Following her testimony, she falls quiet, as the sounds and images of cars passing through the highway fill the blank space. Throughout other points in this film, we are repeatedly shown this type of one-sided dialogue, in which only one side of the conflict is speaking out, while the other one avoids speaking. We are no longer witnessing a silence in dialogue, but a silence that is largely implied through images and sounds that represent these perpetrators hiding. In what is, perhaps, a more stretched interpretation of the definitions given previously, we are shown a montage of different sources, governmental and public alike, all of them openly dismissing and shunning these past events, suggesting them as best left forgotten. In what is one of the liveliest scenes in the film, through its quick cuts and loud piano soundtrack, the film is telling us its message as loudly as it can. And yet, if we remember silence as an absence of any meaningful sound, then, in a certain sense, this scene becomes one of silence, as people from all walks of life unknowingly tiptoeing around or neglecting what needs to be said. Whether reciprocated or not, we have just seen how silence is used to represent dialogue, or rather, a confrontation between those who seek justice and those who seek to forget and ignore these events. To conclude this essay, I am reminded of a scene in the comic book Maus, written by Art Spiegelman. Art, who himself lost relatives in the Holocaust, is all too aware of the importance of not ignoring the past, and, in doing so, points out the irony in needing to make noise to impose silence. In this scene, the protagonist of the book is seen conversing with his therapist, and he is reminded of a quote by Samuel Beckett, who once said, "Every word is like an unnecessary stain on silence and nothingness." Now, after a while, the protagonist, thinking about it, once again, responding to his own previous statement, answers. On the other hand, he did say it.